بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا، إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العظيم. ويتتعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير ونفع إفادة استفادة، وحتى أتمس بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم، ودعاء إلى الهدى ودلالة على الخير، ابتغاء والسلام وطاعته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا، وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما، إنك على كل شيء قدير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله وشكر لله. So, alhamdulillah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gathered us for another session. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed us to see the almost middle of the month of Ramadan, depending on if we started on Monday, we started on Tuesday, that either Monday or Tuesday will be the 15th of Ramadan. And so as quickly as the month comes, that's also oftentimes as quickly as it leaves us. And so, inshallah, we will continue looking at the different narrations in regards to softening of the heart. So, inshallah, excuse me. Inshallah, we'll start with the hadith from Hassan al-Basri. It mentions أدركت أقواما كانت الدنيا تعرض بأحدهم حلالها فيدعها فيقول والله ما أدري على ما أنا من هذه إذا صرت في يدي. And so the meaning of this hadith is that Al-Hasan al-Basri, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, I have met people who refuse to take lawful things of this world that were presented to them, saying, by Allah, I do not know what state I will be in if I take it in my hand. And so this is actually in the chapter from this particular work of Imam Ibn Al-Mubārak on the aspect of the loneliness of this world. And so Hassan al-Basri is mentioning this aspect of the people that he met. And this is something that is oftentimes mentioned about the righteous, is that they are people who they do without even those things that are permissible out of a fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of getting um, either, and there's different ways that we could look at it. One of the fears is having love grow in the heart for that thing. And we say that because oftentimes what happens is that when we are in a situation where the world comes to us, meaning that we are presented with certain things, it allows for those things to grow in our hearts. This is more or less the whole concept of marketing itself. I remember when I was in school and I was taking a marketing class, pretty much the only thing that I really remember from that marketing class in terms of what we learned or were supposed to learn in that class is that I remember something that either my professor said it or it was written in the textbook that we were reading, something of that nature. But in any case, what it said was that the hallmark or the sign of a good marketer is that I can convince people that they need something that they didn't even want. And so I'll say it again, that the hallmark of a good marketer is that I can convince people that they need something that they didn't even want. And so this is part of the aspect of the nature of this dunya, is that sometimes we will be in situations where something comes across us that we had no desire for whatsoever, but it's presented in a way such that it almost feels like we need it. Or it's a situation where maybe it's not even marketed, but we see it, so now we want to engage in it. So an example I can give to that is that, for example, if a person does not watch television, or if they don't go on social media looking at different posts and so on and so forth, generally speaking, you won't have any true desire for anything on television or on social media. But once you click on that television or once you sign into that social media account, then all of a sudden you find yourself possibly spending hours, watching television or searching for things. Why? Because of that one initial catch, that one initial spark that puts you into that moment. And so now you've become distracted, you become engrossed in it. And so part of the aspect of remembering about the loneliness of this world is that everything is temporary. And so again, from the standpoint of the righteous, is that they used to leave off certain things from the standpoint of wanting to keep from having those distractions come to them. Now, the other aspect that we can look at it from the standpoint of this particular statement of Hassan al-Basri is that you have the concept of the dunya possibly leading to the haram. So the first aspect we were talking about, just the aspect of a person increasing in a longing for the dunya, but you also have the concept of the aspect of the dunya, certain aspects of the dunya that may be permissible, ultimately actually leading to the haram. And so this is why, for example, in particular, if we want to talk about this month of Ramadan that we're in, is that they mentioned about many of the righteous is that they used to be very mindful of the conversations that they would have, because they understood that many haram conversations begin by permissible talk, meaning that you start out talking about general things. You start out talking about the weather. You start out talking about the day that you had. You start out talking about what you want to have for iftar, but continuously talking and talking and talking eventually can lead to speech that is of no benefit or even possibly haram. This is why some of the ulama, for example, they caution about certain key triggers that can actually do that in a conversation. So, for example, the ulama, they caution about even asking questions like, how is so-and-so doing? Or have you seen so-and-so? And the reason why they caution about that, because from the outset, just from looking at that, that seems like something that is just a normal part of everyday conversation. You may generally be wanting to know about, a particular person. But the reason why the ulama, they caution about it, and it's not even necessarily a caution in the sense of, never ask that question, but it's more or less a caution in making sure you know who it is that you're talking to in regards to that type of question. And the reason why that is because with certain people, if you ask a question like that, that opens up the floodgates for backbiting. That opens up the floodgates for mentioning things that may worsen relationships between you, and so on and so forth. Meaning that we have to take in consideration who it is that we're talking to and what it is that we are going to allow to take place within the conversation. And for some people, if we know that they incline towards backbiting, then it's not beneficial for them, nor is it beneficial for us to say or ask things that can help them in that. And so even though it would be permissible to ask, how is so-and-so, or have you seen so-and-so? With certain people, that's something that you should just not ask. That you should rather, for example, possibly ask someone else, or just try to check on that person yourself. Because the aspect of this dunya is that this dunya can be a trap. Because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, for example, he mentions in the Quran, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ, that the lust of people have been made beautiful to them. And the thing is that this dunya is primarily filled with what? With lust. That this dunya is nothing, for many instances, you can say that it's nothing but different desires that people have. And so from the standpoint of a believer, we're supposed to try to curb our desires. And this is what one of the major aspects of the month of Ramadan is, in terms of what it's supposed to be teaching us, is to try to learn how to curb our desires. That we start out with the primary desires, as we mentioned, in terms of food and drink. And then if we learn to control that, and we learn to have a full discipline in regards to that, then it's allowing us to see that we can, if we decide to, control all of our other desires. But this aspect of being mindful of the other individuals, being mindful of the things in this world that may be permissible, but that can lead to that which is going to be in our ultimate detriment. This is something to be very mindful of. And so continuing in this Kitab al-Zuhud, is that there's another narration that's mentioned, and this is a description of one of the Sahaba, one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he mentions, تصدق عبد الرحمن بن عوف على أحد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بشطر ماله 4,000 ثم تصدق ب40,000 ثم تصدق ب40,000 ثم تصدق ب40,000 ألف دينار ثم حمل على 500 فرس في سبيل الله ثم على 1,500 راحلة في سبيل الله وكان عامة ماله من التجارة. So this is a description of Abdurrahman bin Auf. And so essentially, part of my intention of relating this particular narration about Abdurrahman bin Auf is to give us inspiration and to give us an understanding of how we're supposed to be in this world. So the translation of the narration, it mentions that in the time of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abdurrahman bin Auf gave half of his wealth in charity, 4,000 dinars, followed by 40,000 dinars, and another 40,000, and yet another 40,000 dinars. Then he provided 500 horses for the path of Allah, and then 1,500 camels for the path of Allah, and the majority of his wealth was from trade. And so, even though we're talking about the aspect of the loneliness of this world and not trying to be distracted by it, is the reality of it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will bless some individuals from the Ummah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with wealth. And the thing is that this is something that is needed. Is that you can't run businesses, you can't run societies, you can't run governments without having funding. And so you need people within the community that have wealth. And so the thing is, though, is that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses a person with wealth, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the people of righteousness, is that, yunfiqun, is that they spend of that. And when we say spend of that, we're talking about spending for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the example of Abdurrahman ibn Auf is that he was an individual that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed with much wealth. There are different narrations, there's different stories about the wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed Abdurrahman ibn Auf with. However, in the case of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, is that you see that he was constantly spending his money fi sabilillah. That he was constantly trying to support Allah and His Messenger sallallahu to the extent that he was capable of. And the thing is that this was something that did not bother him. This was not a burden upon him, because he came to a point of loving to spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he understood that the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is true. It's that the best investment that we can ever make is going to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if we spend for His sake, then He will increase us. And that is a guaranteed return. We don't need to see what the ROI is. The ROI is already guaranteed. And so this is the best investment that we can make. And this is part of the reason why Abdurrahman ibn Auf was so successful, is that when he received the fadl, when he received the benefit from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَمَا بِكُم مِّن نِعْمَةٍ فَمِنَ اللَّهِ, that whatever you have a blessing is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when Abdurrahman ibn Auf received these blessings, what did he do? He spent it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not to say that you don't take care of your own self, that yes, we have responsibilities towards ourselves and our families, in the greater community that we spend upon, but making sure that we are willing and able to spend for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that this is something that Abdurrahman ibn Auf was very much known for. And it mentions at the end of the hadith that he mentions that the bulk of the Abdurrahman ibn Auf's money came from trade. Now, the significant thing here about this is that, for one, is mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that the best occupation a person can have is to be an honest merchant, to be an honest trader. And the reason why some of the ulama mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ said this is because when you get involved in buying and selling, when you get involved in being a merchant, it becomes very easy to be dishonest. Why? Because you want to sell your product, and so sometimes you may embellish, or you may hide, or you may inflate, and so on and so forth. So it becomes more difficult to be an honest merchant. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions that the best occupation that you can have is to be an honest merchant. And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he was a merchant, and he was honest in his dealings, and we can see the merit of that, is that he had the capability to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these different capacities. However, what we need to mention here as well is that we would still consider Abdurrahman ibn Auf from amongst the zuhad, from amongst those who were abstinent from the dunya. And the reason why we say that is because, as many of the ulama clarify for us, is that this aspect of having abstinence from the dunya, this aspect of having a detachment from the dunya, is that the dunya is in your hand but not in your heart. That a person who is flooded with wealth, they have more money than anyone can imagine. That person may very well be a zahid, while at the same time a person that has nothing and never takes anything can be far removed from being a zahid. And the way that works, or the way that can happen, is that the person that may have much in terms of wealth may not have any of it enter his heart. And when we say that it's not entering his heart, what does that mean? It means that it's not that the person is looking to be in a state of impoverishment, but rather it's a situation where that person, whether they're impoverished or whether they're wealthy, is not going to affect their relationship with Allah. And they're not longing for the dunya. It's just that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given it to them. And so because they have it, they utilize it in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're not concerned with having it. Whereas the person that may have nothing, or may outwardly purport that they don't want to have nothing, they may inwardly still be desirous of the dunya. So that's why the ulama mentioned, they mentioned that as long as a person is desirous of the dunya, it doesn't matter how much wealth they have, that person is a faqir, that person is impoverished. And as long as a person is not longing in their heart for anything of the dunya, that person is ghani, that person is rich in terms of richness from the dunya, no matter how much wealth they don't have. So from the standpoint of Islam, that is the hallmark of wealth. So if you have the wealthiest person that you could think of, but they're still longing for more things of this world, or they're still feeling insecure about the money that they have in this world, then that person is still a faqir. That person is still impoverished. While the person who may not have much of anything, may be living at the lower ends of society in terms of impoverishment, but they're completely free of need. They're completely without wants of anything additional of this dunya. That person is the one that's truly wealthy. And so it's a different type of concept in terms of how we look at the nature of this world and the nature of whether we have things or not. And just to kind of reiterate this a little bit more, this is another narration that's speaking of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. And so this is, show you his understanding of the nature of the dunya and his fear of the dunya. So this is on Sa'ib ibn Ibrahim, related from his father, that Abdurrahman ibn Auf was brought food while he was fasting. And he said, قتل مصعب ibn Umair, وهو خير مني, وقفنا في بردتي, إن أطي رأسه بدت رجلاه, when غطت رجلاه بدا رأسه, وراه قال وقتل حمزة وهو خير مني, ثم بسط لنا من الدنيا ما بسط, أو قال أعطينا من الدنيا ما أعطينا, وخشينا أن تكون حسناتنا قد أجلت لنا, ثم جعل يبكي حتى ترك طعام. So Mus'ab ibn Munair, so again, this is something that Abdurrahman ibn Auf was saying when food was brought to him on the day that he was fasting. So Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he said, Musa ibn Umair, who was better than me. So you see the humility of Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He's saying, Huwa khayran minni, he was better than I was killed and shrouded in his mantle. When it covered his head, his feet would show. And if it covered his feet, his head would show. Meaning that he died in such a state that he didn't have enough wealth to have a shroud that would cover him completely. That if he covered his head, it wouldn't cover his feet. And if he covered his feet, it wouldn't cover his head. He didn't have enough to cover his full body. I think he also said Hamza, who was better than me, was killed, but then the affluence of this world was given to us. Or he said, we were given of this world what we were given, and we feared that the fruit of our good actions was given to us in advance. Then he began to weep until he left the food. So Abdurrahman ibn Auf, what he was saying was that he was fearful that because of the affluence that had come to him, even the aspect of the food that was being brought to him from the standpoint of him breaking his fast, that he was fearful that the rewards of his good deeds were being hastened to him in this life. So that was the concept that the Sahaba and that the righteous have, is that they fear actually receiving their reward in this life. Because the concept being is that if I receive my reward in this life, then I may not have anything left in the hereafter. And that's where it really counts. That's where it really matters. And so you can see here that Abdurrahman ibn Auf, as we mentioned before, is that his concept was that he had a great fear and a great concern about not being deceived by this dunya. Even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with the dunya, he didn't want to have a heart connection to the dunya. And I would say that for many of us, if we can just get to the point of at least partially removing ourselves from this dunya, in terms of the longings that we have for it. This is why we said before, for those of us who attended the Ramadan prep program, is that my suggestion for all of us was to remove ourselves from the social media and the in the small screen, whether it be from the standpoint of television, computers, laptops, tablets, phones. Just look at how many different things I have to name to try to cover them all. Is that to try to remove ourselves from them so that we're not constantly bombarded with these things that are trying to come into our hearts, with these things and these advertisements that are trying to convince us that we need these things that we wouldn't even necessarily want if we never even seen them. And that it can alleviate many of the different issues that we go through on a day-to-day basis. Now, the thing is that oftentimes these things that have to deal with the heart are much easier said than done. As one of my teachers have said to me before when I was still in Yemen, he said that the science of tazkiyat nafs, the science of tasawwuf, the science of purification of the heart, he said that this is a science where it's easy to understand, but it's very difficult to implement. That many of the concepts within the aspect of purification of the heart are very easy to understand. And oftentimes, no one would disagree with them. However, the actual the actual acting upon it, the implementation of that is very difficult. Whereas, for example, something like the science of fiqh, where it has to do with Islamic law, that is something that can be very difficult to understand. However, once you understand it, it's very easy to implement. It's very easy to act upon it. And so the thing is that we want to be like Imam Shafi has been related to have wrote in one of his lines of poetry. It's related that he had said, "Faqiyyan wa shufiyun," "Faqiyyan wa sufiyan laysa wahidihuma." That be a faqih and a person of tasawwuf and a person of tazkiyat nafs and a Sufi, laysa wahidihuma, not just one of the two. That be a person who learns the law, so you know what is for you and what against you, and what is obligatory for you and what is prohibited from you. But also at the same time, be a person that works upon their soul. Because being either one or the other is not going to be necessarily sufficient. Because if you know the law, but you don't know the spirit of the law, meaning that you don't know the law of the heart. Sometimes it can be also referred to as fiqh al-batin, the laws of the inner self. Is that if you just know the outward law, then you may have a heart that is fully corrupted. So you know outwardly how to pay zakat and so on and so forth, but you may be, still a person that is completely entranced with the life of this world. That the dunya is still in your heart. But also at the same time, don't just be a person of spirituality, a person of tazkiyat nafs without knowing the law. Because then you can go into the opposite extreme where you do things and you say things that are impermissible from the standpoint of the religion. And so doing both, knowing the law, but also at the same time working on purifying the heart. And one of the primary ways that we can, especially in our times, work on this aspect of purifying the heart is to remove the dunya from it. And again, that's easier said than done. So inshallah, we will stop here. We will leave you all in Allah's care. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will continue to bless you in this blessed month of Ramadan, and that this month of Ramadan will be a Ramadan that is like no other that you ever had, and that as many Ramadans as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to continue to see, that it only gets better and better and better, so that we come to a point where we can be a part of those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions as being the nafs mutma'innah. So that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say that we have a tranquil soul, so that He will say to our souls, Irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiyya. Return to your Lord, pleased and well pleased. So we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those, and that is not difficult for Allah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam wa asbana wa ni'mal wakeel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.